address the harmful impact of gendered expectations of disaster. And of course, today and the next few days are really big in New South Wales and Queensland, and we are all thinking of our colleagues and those communities that are being threatened by Cyclone Alfred. We are recording today's webinar so that you can take a look at it later and share it with your friends and colleagues. If you have any questions for our speakers, please include them in the chat and we'll go through them as the webinar progresses. And just a reminder to please keep yourselves on mute. So, of course, Saturday is International Women's Day, and it's a time where we can reflect on progress, call for change, and celebrate the courage and determination of the women who changed history, those who will advance gender equity into the future. Women have come a long way in our sector, and the fact that we can have a network of over 2,000 members is evidence of this. And there are many who have paved the way for us to have the fabulous careers that we have today. But there's still a long way to go to ensure that the working lives of the young women following in our footsteps can have safe, equitable and fulfilling roles in their careers. And with diversity and inclusion under attack in the US, International Women's Day is even more important than ever. There's a great article on the power and importance of diversity by Laurie Peake, the director of the USA's Natural Hazard Centre, and I'll pop that in the chat when I get a chance. We do have some special guests joining us today, and I'll introduce them properly as each of them come along. We have Dr. Margaret Moreton, Dr. Mika, Dr. Tara Lomax, and Rosie Q. But a little bit about the movies we're going to be talking about today, Twister and Twisters. So many of you will be familiar with these movies. Some of you will have rewatched them just recently, as I know I did, and so have our guests. Twister, of course, was made in 1996, directed by Jan de Bont. It stars an ensemble cast, including Helen Hunt, Bill Paxton, Jamie Gertz, and Carey Elwes. It follows a group of storm chasers who are trying to deploy a tornado research device during a severe outbreak in Oklahoma. The film was a huge hit and grossed almost $500 million worldwide, becoming the second biggest grossing film of 1996. It received largely positive reviews from critics. It received an Academy Award nominations for Best Visual Effects and Best Sound. And I think the visual effects are something that really stand the test of time for this movie. Twisters, released last year, is an American disaster film and a sequel directed by Lee Isaac Chung. It serves as a standalone sequel and stars Daisy Edgar Jones, Glenn Powell, Anthony Ramos, Brendan Pereira, and others. And this film follows clashing groups of storm chasers, and we might learn more about that as the webinar progresses, who are investigating a tornado outbreak in Oklahoma. It also received pretty positive reviews from critics and grossed about $370 million worldwide. Enough about me. I am going to move on to our first speaker, Dr. Margaret Moreton. A little bit about Margaret. Margaret is the new CEO of Gender and Disaster Australia, having finished up late last year as Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. Margaret has many years' experience in emergency management and disaster resilience and is particularly keen on community resilience. Margaret, tell us what you thought of these two films.
Thanks, Bridget. I will indeed, and there are so many things I thought of these two films. So first, before I launch into a few opening reflections, I would like to just acknowledge that not only is Cyclone Alfred bearing down, and therefore some people listening may well have that happening in the background, and I know, for example, that Rosie does, I would like to acknowledge that that is a distracting influence today, and that our hearts are with you for those of us who are way down here in Victoria. And I would also like to acknowledge that different people will have different lived experience, not only of disaster events, but also of domestic and family violence, which I'll touch on in a moment. And I just want to acknowledge that they are ongoing traumas and potentially triggering experiences. So take care while you're listening to this semi-light-hearted discussion about a very, very important set of issues. The first thought that I would share is that disasters are actually more than the response phase where the crisis is at its most extreme danger. So a lot of work is done in the preparation, planning, long-term resilience building, recovery processes. And these films are, at their very nature, dramas. And so they skip all that hard work. They just go to the drama. And I get that, but I just wanted to point out that that's not how contributions to disasters work. They're also essentially romances. And depending on your point of view of romances, I think my most compelling reaction is that the happy ending for the movie, now I'm very aware of spoiler alerts, so I'll try to be general, is where the main characters either kiss with swelling music or there's the promise of a relationship, surrounded in the first movie by utter devastation, including a family standing in some bewilderment, holding hands and holding their children close, looking at the complete destruction of their life. But nevertheless, we have a happy, romantic moment with whooping and cheering. Forgive me for being a little bit cynical. But I want to also go back a little and say a shout out to the various women who are listening today, because I know a lot of us will have different roles in relation to disasters. And if I just unpack a couple of bits of information for you about how disasters affect women in particular, Deb Parkinson, who was the predecessor for me here in this role at GaDAus, and Claire Zara did some really important seminal research about the effect of disasters on women following Black Saturday, which was a very devastating fire, a sequence of fires in 2009. And in their study discovered that women in heavily impacted communities are 7 times more likely to experience domestic violence than women in non-heavily impacted communities. Now, the incidence of domestic violence in this country is already obscene. To multiply that, and also to note that it's happening in a period of time that is traumatic for a whole range of reasons, is a really serious issue that we need to address. We know that women can perish in a disaster. We know of examples where women have died because they did not leave, and that the trigger for them not leaving was that their partner would not. We also have examples of women and children not being able to leave because they didn't have, for example, access to a vehicle, because they're a one-car family and the male of the family had taken the vehicle in order to go and do something contributing to the defence. So there are all sorts of issues around women being disproportionately affected during the event and also after the event because of access to resources, access to housing, and access to just the sorts of economic supports and social supports that many of us would rely on. Now, flipping that, women also are very involved and visible in leading recovery work, because we socially, now some of this is a little bit generalised, but we have many examples where the women are the ones who lead the recovery process. There are communities in the Blue Mountains, communities like Lismore, where women have been leading recovery and resilience building effort before and after events, often with minimal financial support. So not only are we disproportionately affected, but we also add disproportionate value as a gender. I do want to make one comment about men. Men too have traumas as a result of these events, but it's International Women's Day, so I'm deliberately choosing the issues that affect women. A couple of things I thought I'd throw in so we could all think about. There were a couple of elements of the movies that I noticed. There was a shower scene in the first movie. So there's a shower scene and it's the female character. Now, there's no shower scene. Everyone showered, but for some reason we had to enter the shower when the woman was in the shower. In the second film, there's no shower scene, but there is a rain scene, and it's the man. Now, I'm a heterosexual female. I'm partial to a good-looking man. He's gorgeous. However, it had me wondering, is this a good development Or is this a worrying development? If I think about all the young boys who now have a potentially unrealistic body model in terms of their own mental health, as we all watch an extremely good-looking man in an extremely close-fitting white T-shirt in the rain. So, difference between the two movies about the gender there. Also, a difference I noticed is that the heroic moment in movie 2 is 100% owned by the woman. The extremely heroic moment that leads to the climax of the film is hers. That's not the case in movie 1. Is it a good thing? Not sure, but it's certainly the case. Final comment, and then I'll stop. Final comment is about the character of the older woman. Now, you might be unsurprised that I noticed this. In both movies, the older woman character lives alone, is somewhat isolated, is actually the subject of significant danger for the main characters as they seek to save the older woman, rescue the older woman. The only thing the older women in the movies don't have are heaps of cats or chickens. I'm a chicken woman myself. So the older woman is just a really interesting portrayal in both movies. Neither older woman is well-connected socially, strong network, where in fact, I know that we are. So that's an interesting thing. And I will too put some information in the chat about the Bechdel test. If any of you are not familiar with the Bechdel test, for example, it measures the success of a book or a movie on the basis of whether two female characters who are named, so they're not allowed to be unnamed waitresses or people on the street, two female characters with names speak to each other about anything other than the man. And for example, I found that Twister, the original, out of 113 minutes of film, 4 minutes and 15 seconds involved conversation between women, and only 2 minutes and 14 seconds were not about the man. So I'll pop some information about the Bechdel test for anyone who's not familiar. And I think I'll stop and hand back to you, Bridget.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And for those of you that are not familiar with Gender and Disaster Australia, they have a long history of doing work in this space, looking at, the confluence of gender and disasters from a range of different perspectives. And I'd really encourage you to jump on the website and have a look through their various resources. There are some really fascinating and important discussions that are available for you to take a look at. So I'm very pleased to introduce now our next speaker, who's going to bring a very different perspective to this conversation. And that's what's really exciting about our lineup of speakers today, is that everyone's coming at it from a slightly different angle. So I'm really pleased to introduce to you Dr. Mika Peace. Mika is a fire weather researcher at the Bureau of Meteorology. Her research focuses on bushfire case studies and running high-resolution fire atmosphere coupled simulations to explore and document fire and atmosphere interactions during major bushfires. During high impact weather situations, Mika also takes on an operational role, briefing key stakeholders on the weather situation and assessing likely impacts on the community. Mika also regularly presents nationally and internationally at conferences and workshops, invited media interviews, does STEM events in schools and science events in the community. Mika, great to have you here. Tell us about Twisters.
Thanks, Bridget. So unlike Margaret, I'm going to talk a little bit about the science and the women scientists and perspectives on that. So most of what I do is fire weather rather than thunderstorms. But a couple of my colleagues, men and women, are mad keen storm chasers, and they actually go all the way over to the United States to storm chase on their holidays. And a couple of them have been storm chasing with one of the guys who was a consultant on the movie. So there were quite a lot of scientists, male and female scientists, from the National Weather Agency at NOAA, who were actually consultants, and some of them were extras on the movie. So they actually did go to quite a lot of effort to involve the meteorologists who actually work in this in real life on the movie set. And their friend actually took the movie cast and crew storm chasing. So the cast and crew have actually been out there in real time storm chasing. On the whole, the representation in the science in the films was reasonably accurate. They went to quite a lot of work to get the terminology right. So a lot of the words that you hear in there about shear and vorticity and cape and outflows, that's the way that we actually do talk about these things. And I also noticed in the movies that the radar displays, and we use radar a lot when we're looking at storms in particular, but also a whole range of other different meteorology and the computer displays. I think that actually use real radar screens in the film. So the data looked really realistic, and I think it probably was realistic. And also the idea that they've got all of these trucks and utes with all of these equipment on them that they go out into the field with, that's certainly the case as well. So we use the radar a lot. We also need observations of things like temperature and humidity and wind speed, and those were referred to in the film. And that's some of the things that people actually do go out into the field and measure. I think importantly, the films did capture that idea of going out into the field with a whole heap of instrumentations to take observations that we can then take back to a computer lab and understand the physical processes of what's actually driving these weather systems. Because the only way to understand them really is to go out and measure them and then use those measurements to build models. That's the way science works. And the real motivation for that is improving our physical understanding so that we can then improve the warning systems and the messages that go out to communities. So that part of it was certainly true. As for the women scientists, there's actually a friend of mine and a colleague in the United States. Her name is Karen Kasiba, and that's her real job. Her and her team actually have this entire fleet of radars that are mounted on vehicles of different size. I think they've got about a dozen vehicles in their fleet. And their job is to do these field campaigns and take this set of radars out and point them at different meteorological phenomena, including severe storms and tornadoes. And then they take all of that data back to the lab and analyse it to improve the science, which then feeds into the warning systems. And Karen's an amazing scientist. She's fantastic. And you could definitely put her in a Hollywood movie and she'd own it. But we met because we've both worked on looking at radar data pointed at fire plumes, because obviously one of the things that they can do is point their suite of radars at fire plumes. And we've looked at radars and fire plumes following particularly the Black Summer events, because in Black Summer, during Black Summer in New South Wales, there were 2 verified fire-generated vortices, so fire-generated tornadoes, which occurred in New South Wales. We sometimes call these fire whirls, fire-generated vortices, fire tornadoes. And we actually had to do some reporting on these, and we did exactly sort of the process that's shown in the film. We went out and we looked at the data, we looked at the observations, we collected all the information that we could, and then we designed, or we built a narrative, a story with the physical underlying processes for what actually happened. And we were looking at things like the vehicle movements, whether the vehicles were moved or flung by the winds. And we did estimate that in those fire generated vortices that happened in Australia and New South Wales, we had tornadic winds to EF3 or EF4 strength. So the process that we went through was the same. So there are definitely jobs and roles for women scientists in the field. I think that the first film in Dorothy that they had was probably pretty representative of what was actually happening with the science at the time in terms of getting instrumentation up into the tornado. But when we got to the second film, Twister, it was a little bit disappointing that no, you can't actually disrupt a tornado no matter how much stuff you put into it. So that part of it, the scientific credibility kind of fell over. And I think that was a shame, because I think they could have given Kate a real piece of science rather than a fake piece of science. But I also think maybe that's a little bit of a change, a reflection of our changes in attitude, that 30 years ago we wanted to understand these things as society, and now we want to control them. But the director, I think it was, said that it was meant to be a Hollywood movie. It wasn't meant to be a documentary, and it certainly achieved that.
Fantastic. Mika, is that all? Is that the end of your discussion for the minute?
I could talk about the science for ages, but I know that you've got Tara and Rosie.
We've got more, absolutely.
Who'd like to give their perspectives. And I think the range of perspectives on this is really quite fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely it is. Look, and thank you so much. I've learned a lot. I think that's why there was that deadly silence. I was just absorbing so much of what you had to say. Thank you so much, Mika. I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker. Again, as I said, coming from a very different perspective, Dr. Tara Lomax. Dr. Lomax is from the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, where she teaches master's students. Tara's expertise is in the area of contemporary Hollywood entertainment, blockbuster cinema, and media franchising. She has experience in the entertainment and higher education sectors and has published widely with reputable journals and university presses. Welcome, Tara. Tell us about these two films.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks so much for having me, for the invitation. I just want to acknowledge just quickly that I'm on Gadigal land in Sydney. And I also just want to acknowledge that I agree wholeheartedly with the need for cynicism about some of this simplistic representation of women in these films. But what I want to do is give a little bit of a perspective, or maybe a context on why those things might be happening in these films. And to do so might mean that I'm distancing a bit from actually the disaster part of this. So I don't mean to, put that at the side, but there is more going on to why these films perhaps are doing these things, and not in a defense, just more in my approach to understanding a film is understanding the construction and why things have happened historically in this way. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. And so 2 points of context that I'd like to raise that may help us understand a little bit more is genre and also industry and audience. So they're the 2 points I'm going to talk about a little bit. So the first thing is, and I assume that, we understand that genre is something that works to give audiences a sense of expectation. It's about a familiarity. Audiences, need to want to know what we're going to get. But in terms of storytelling, there's a little bit more sort of systematic mechanisms, I guess, going on in terms of how conventions work over time. So genre is usually defined by an underpinning mythic base that drives what's actually happening in the genre. So usually it's symbolically representing something else. Okay, so maybe we can also talk about that if I don't get to it directly. But this mythic base comes from an interplay of 2 components. Familiar conventions, they're the things that, we go in and say, okay, I know what I'm going to get, but also variation. And that variation is what keeps people who know the genre coming back for more. Otherwise, we just would see the same films over and over again. Some will argue that that's still what we see in many genres, but there is a lot of room for variation. But in some genres, there's more room for variation in others. And perhaps the disaster genre has perhaps less room for variation than other genres, and that relates to its budget needs and the production values that are required in terms of VFX and its industry model, which I'll get to in a moment. But firstly, it's important to see how the disaster genre actually works as a subgenre of the action film more broadly, okay? So the mythic kind of ideas that drive the action movie are actually more geared towards male characters and their space in the world than they are women. And so by association, we usually have a masculine hero. And in the 80s, the masculine hero, there was a cycle, you would know the Predator, the Rambo, the Commando, and these were actually a reflection of the politics at the time, the Reaganite politics of the time, which was the movement towards a more hard body, shiny, male, big, muscular physiques. And these were actually in response to the move towards the new man stereotype, the metrosexual stereotype that we do get to see then in the 90s, which you can probably see happening more in the Twister representation of masculinity. But I just want to flag this context because we then got some room for variation in this in the 80s with the female version. And we got the Terminator. We got the, Ellen Ripley in Alien. We got Catherine Bigelow's Blue Steel. So we got some instances where we had room for variation. But fundamentally, what we're looking here with women in this space, in the action film more broadly, is they are either romantically connected to a lead man, helpless and need rescuing, or, which I think we start to see more in some disaster movies, particularly Twister, is express their reckless side a little bit more, right? They're the ones that end up sometimes jumping in and the man has to hold them back. So we have that kind of little trope that happens. But the other thing with the action film, and this relates then to the disaster movie subgenre, is the aesthetic pleasure that we get from cinematic excess and spectacle. So in these types of films, we're rarely going to see a complex story. We're going for something else, all right? And so that something else in the disaster subgenre relates to the themes of things like survival. And that excess, though, is designed to to distance us from the threat in some way. So it's not designed to be, and that's a great segue to, I think it was Mika's point about these aren't documentaries. They're not aiming to represent the world that it is, as much as it must be needed. These are trying to do something else, and they are trying to fulfill a different pleasure for human entertainment. So from the perspective of filmmaking, the disaster movies are usually symbolically mythic. There's something else that they're representing. They're not aimed to represent authenticity in these scenarios, because if they did, people probably wouldn't go see them. And then they're not going to make up the money that's required to make them. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But also the history of the disaster subgenre does include other kinds of films that may not be associated with sort of science, things like biblical epics, monster movies, alien invasions. And that's a bit relevant to a point that I sort of want to make about an example of another film that I think actually gives us a really good representation of the role of women, the potential for the role of women in these films, which I'll get to in a moment. But these movie types do shape that symbolic convention of the disaster movie. So story, as I said, is not the most important part of these genres. Spectacle is the story here. Fundamentally, the disaster is central to the story, but also the threat is indiscriminating and all-encompassing. The main character is usually a white heterosexual man with flawed fatherhood skills. And we often see that happening in a lot of these kinds of films, and probably less so though in Twister and Twisters. That's actually, but they are flawed partners in many ways. Maybe less so in Twisters, but flawed friends, perhaps. I'm not sure if we can then, read that in there into the representation of the female lead. But in the classical form, we often get a range of character types. We get scientists or other academic or technical specialists. We get politicians, we get military leaders, we get news people, we get shady rich business people, we get and we get the helpless or ineffectual woman. Now, we might then associate that character type, the ineffectual woman, with the damsel in distress, right? Of the adventure film. So these character types really have much depth to them, but depending on the film and how well it is written, the collection of character types that we can get in these films can have the capacity to enable some really interesting social subtle commentary on things like socioeconomic class, and that even the most rich will get taken by this threat, political corruption, and a lack of funding in science research often is a little plot line in these films. So there is capacity for this to be there, but there are other reasons of why this doesn't happen. Now, I want to just say that obviously Twister and Twisters are the films we're talking about today, but for those of you who haven't seen this film, I want to recommend a film, Arrival. And I don't know how many of you might have seen this, but it's an alien invasion movie. However, it does play and use all the tropes of the disaster movie. We have a female academic. She's not a scientist though, she's a linguist. And she is called in to speak to translate the speech patterns of these two alien life forms. She goes in to, speak with them, and she demands being on the field, not just through a recorder. And what emerges in this film, though, is that communication is actually the thing that saves and prevents the threat, not conflict, because the men in the room want to jump to conflict, while the women, the female linguist, ends up unlocking a key to human collaboration, and that is the power of communication and language. But what's interesting about this film is it emerges that the aliens are not the threat. humans themselves are the threat. And I think that's an interesting example of how this genre has room for variation and how the disaster works mythically, the threat works mythically. Now, I don't want, obviously, I know I'm sort of probably running out of time, but I do just want to touch on the sort of industry constraints on films like this. Some films, as I said, have more room for variation than others. And a reason for that is small budgets, like horror, for instance, has a lot of room for variation. Budgets can be smaller. But films like disaster movies require really big budgets, which means the room for risk is really, really low. So as an industrial mode, the disaster genre is always a blockbuster. Especially storm-related movies like Twister and Twisters. This is particularly because of the high VFX and special effects costs. And because of the need for stars. That's another thing too, which I won't have time to go into right now, but maybe we can later. This becomes a limitation on its capacity for variation. So this kind of film is what's called in Hollywood to be a 4Q film, a 4 quadrants film. The 4 quadrants of film marketing are old, young, male, female. It's a bit outdated, but as is the psychology behind the marketing strategies. And the hypothesis that has driven Hollywood for a very long time, and this is eroding now in the age of niche audiences and streaming and a whole bunch of different shifts in diversity. But the idea is that women will go see films aimed for men, but men will not go see films aimed for women. And so that is one of the reasons why films like disaster films don't treat women very well. The representation is simplistic and it's usually quite potentially damaging. But the idea here is that the audience is male and that the women are there for the ride, so to speak. This, like I said, is changing. But the other thing is that they use something called a high concept model, which is a simplistic narrative, but also relies on things like genre familiarity, adaptation, and stardom. So these are some of the things that do influence why films end up like this. And so I have some other things that we can talk about in relation to the international disaster movies. They are also similar in their representation. Chinese disaster movies are very, very similar in how they depict women with trauma. Trauma is driving their, recklessness. Those kinds of narratives are also in a lot of international disaster movies, but also there's something to be said for the attraction of women in these roles as well. And it's part of the spectacle. And also things to reflect on in relation to what this means in contemporary time, where we think about climate change and how we are seeing a shift. And I would just to jump onto one of those points that were said earlier, I would suggest that Twisters hypothesizes that we can control the twister as a sort of symbol of trying to get us to do something about climate change symbolically. So anyway, there's a bit there more I can say, but I'll leave it there for now.
Wow, thank you so much, Tara. It's absolutely fascinating, and I could just see everybody sitting quite agog. It's not very often that we get this kind of a perspective in our sector, and to hear your expertise and your insights, into this genre is absolutely fascinating. I'm sure we could talk for hours. But I am going to move on to our final speaker for today. And with great excitement, I'm going to introduce to you Rosie Q. Rosie has had a lifelong interest in weather of all kinds, has been chasing storms in Australia for more than 10 years with a camera in her hand, and even longer without. She has a passion for capturing beautiful images of what the sky can create, and she has a large online photographic portfolio, and we'll try and pop a link in the chat. But these are just her hobbies. Rosie has a bachelor's degree in applied science and a master's in dementia, was a single mum to her now grown children, and has a 32-year career as an occupational therapist. Rosie currently works in an innovative role with Frontline Emergency Services in Queensland. Rosie, welcome. Tell us what it's like to chase a storm.
Well, I'm glad that we had this is my hobby. I'm feeling very overwhelmed by sitting on a panel with all the doctors with their wonderful expertise. But I'd like to think I have some real world expertise, and I think that's what the movies really capture, is that that wonderful, this is the world that they are actually in, and it's actually not horrifically far from what I guess we somewhat experience as storm chasers. I'm not an actual researcher when it comes to weather. I do this purely for my own interest. Interesting that in more recent times, because I've made some very strong connections since the early 2000s with a lot of meteorologists who run some private firms here in Australia, and put together software packages and early warning systems and things like that. And we do quite a lot of work off, for no pay, just for the pure pleasure of doing it, in real world testing of a lot of their products. So hail trackers and things like that. We can ground truth what size hail, their software predicts what size hail it might have, and we can actually be on the ground chasing these storms and actually tell them what kind of hail we see. So they can refine some of their tools, and that can actually help with that forward warning of storms and things like that. So it really flows on from what Mika was actually saying. Mika actually, she didn't steal. She brought up a number of good points that I had already jotted down for my own reflection. So I won't necessarily go back over those, but there's a lot of things about the movies that are really true from a storm chasing point of view. It is reasonably a team sport. I chase on my own mostly nowadays, but there is a team of others who we like interests. Quite a lot of them meteorologists. A lot of them are some of the best chasers in Australia. They chase in the US. I have a lot of storm chasing friends in the US. Probably I've come to realize I probably share some friendships and colleagueships with Mika, with some of the people, the GaDAus operators and people that chase storms around in the storm season in the US. So I have access to a lot of information from those people, and are involved actively with some of the training and education that can happen. But around the movies, I guess my reflections were, Twisters has been held in super high regard by the chasing community in the US and here in Australia ever since it came out. And, when Bill Paxton passed away, there was a lot of grief around that, and people still hold him in quite high regard. It's interesting. I watched it again on the weekend with that lens of looking at the gender roles. I can't say I necessarily took a lot of interest in that, or the romance aspect of it. I guess a lot of female chasers see Jo as the badass. She's the one leading the team. She's the one doing the science. She's the one out there driving around, trying out this new science and trying to get some answers, driven from the mere fact that she lost something really valuable to her, and she really wants to understand and not have this happen for other people. I think there's a definite driver of why we're interested in weather like this, around that fear factor. I was terrified of storms as a child, and my very smart mother encouraged me to learn more about them, with the idea that education is a key to unlocking fear. You can get on top of fear if you actually learn more about what it is, the thing that you fear. And once you know a lot more about it, it dispels all that myth, and you actually can ground yourself in it. And it's a lot more, and you can appreciate it for the beauty that it actually is. So to me, what really struck me was that I probably hadn't noticed so much, but how much Bill really intrudes upon Jo and her science. This is her science. She's been out there doing it. He's left. He's gone. He's going to be a weatherman. He's left her. He's left the science team. He's moved on. He's going off and pursuing his own things, and then just by chance happens to step back in. And there's a really key moment that really struck me when Melissa, his new fiance, is talking to Jo and says, what's Dorothy? What does that do? What's the purpose of that? And Jo starts telling her about the science of what that is, and Bill just steps right on top of her and takes over, just like talking about what that science is. And Jo actually gives him a look like, okay, then it's all yours, kind of thing. This apparently was his idea, according to the movie. She's the one actually making it happen. So I find that really, a bit jarring, and I probably always did. And again, at the end, they're arguing about, okay, so I'm going to run the lab and you're going to do the analysis. And he says, oh, no, I'm going to run the lab, you're going to do the analysis. So that's the thing, that he's the lead when he's the person that had stepped away from it in the first place. So that kind of grates on me a little bit. And as a storm chaser in a very male-dominated, kind of interest area, I guess, women sometimes are trodden on. And if we do start to look like we might know what we're talking about, sometimes that you're kind of just told to take a back seat. Thank you very much. I'm finding that that's changing over time. And I guess maybe that's reflected a little bit in how Twisters is then portrayed, because it definitely is a much more, very much supports that idea that the female actually has the lead. She can save the day. It is her science. They're pursuing her science. They allow her to pursue her science. Isn't that terrible? Terrible to say it that way. They support her to pursue that science, is probably a better way to say it. So I guess that's the reflection for me. Kate, really comes from a place of not necessarily fearing storms, but just having an intense interest in it. Having grown up in Oklahoma, she's been exposed to it. Her mum talks about her running out and staying in the middle of a cornfield naked as a 5-year-old, staring up at the sky, looking at storms. She has obviously what they portray is quite an instinct for chasing storms. Unlike, Bill, who sniffs the dirt, Kate just obviously has done the education. She's obviously very well educated. She understands how CAPE and all the other observations work, how the models work. People refer to her throughout the movie and say, hey, Kate, what do you think this storm's going to do? And everybody looks at Kate for Kate, what's Kate going to do? With this thing that she's maybe magic. And I find in the storm chasing community, there are people who have all the head knowledge, and again, the other teams in Twister, they have all the knowledge and all the right gear and everything else, but no instinct. I think they portray that instinct aspect well in Kate, but she has the education behind her too. I wish I had that education. I don't have that education, but that's okay. I have my own education. I do everything. So that's, I find it really good that that whole concept of she has her science, she's seeing that science through to the end, and they allow her to shine as the storm chasing goddess that she is, and she saves the day. Yeehaw. Mika's already made comment that the science in that regard is significantly flawed, and the response from the storm chasing community was that a lot of I have to say male storm chasers poo-pooed the movie, saying, this is terrible. This is, this science is flawed. This won't ever work. And again, I think it was pointed out, as Mika said, that it's really not a documentary. It's a movie for the pleasure of watching it. And interestingly, amongst the female storm chasing fraternity, it's a very well accepted movie and very watched multiple times. Probably somewhat with the Glen Powell factor playing into that. I'll admit to that myself. But I think I enjoy that the romance aspect isn't too featured. It's implied without actually being followed through on, and I quite like that. It doesn't take away from the story necessarily. It just kind of adds a layer. But I can understand the cynicism around that, because why do we even have to have that? Why can't we just have women do that? It just to let you know that women chasers are increasing. There are a lot more of us. When I started chasing, 20 odd years ago, and being in contact with other chasers, there was only very few women chasers. There are now a lot more women chasers, and we are becoming a lot more prominent and a lot more vocal. So that's fabulous. It's a little less of a male-dominated kind of interest area, and there are a lot of opportunities for women to learn how to storm chase. Girls Who Chase is an American organisation who are just friends of mine, and they provide a lot of online training to teach women and girls how to chase safely, because it's not an interest area without its significant risks. So, I could talk about the movies and storm chasing forever, but we probably need to move on.
Wow, thank you so much, Rosie. And like our other speakers, you've really provided us with a perspective that, most of us will not have come across before. And to be able to talk to a real life storm chaser is a real privilege. And you have 20 years of expertise. Please don't discount the lack of expertise because you don't have a doctor in front of your name. You obviously have your professional career, which is one thing, but an extraordinary amount of expertise in this hobby. We might move on to some questions now. So please feel free to pop your questions in the chat. In the meantime, I do have a couple of questions for our panellists, which I'll start with. Margaret, I might start with you. The director of Twister said, "I wanted Helen because she reminds me of a whirlwind. She can boss people around. She's got a strong persona, which I like." When Helen Hunt was asked if this was a fair assessment of her, she said, "Oh, I can boss people around. I mean, I guess so. I can act like I can boss people around." And I thought that was a really interesting thing to say, certainly indicative of the time, but it also made me think about, that notion of women and girls being bossy rather than assertive. And this notion of acting as well. And acting is something that women feel that they may need to do to get on in their careers, particularly as they enter leadership levels that can be very male-dominated. What are your thoughts on this?
It's an entire seminar on its own. That would be my first thought. And yes, every now and again, one of the things you can do when you don't have to worry about editing your voice in your own home is you can shout at the television. So every now and again, I will tell the television off because of issues like this. When Rosie was talking a minute ago, I was thinking, absolutely, not only does the male talk over the female, answer questions posed to the female that are in her field of expertise, but there are also moments where the male forces the female, talk about lack of consent, to be in a dangerous situation. So the female might be saying, "Stop, stop, stop, we need to stop this, this is not okay." And the male will go, "It's fine," and press the accelerator. And then afterwards, here's me shouting at the television, the woman will go, we did it. And I'm thinking, women die because of this behaviour. Women die because of this behaviour, and it makes me very, very cross. I know it's only a movie. So yes, feisty women who are considered bossy. Whatever happened to clear, direct leadership material? Oh no, bossy. And then I've encountered it in my career. I'm sure many people on this call have encountered it. Overly emotional females, because we get angry about something or we express a strongly held view about something. So there's this constant balance about trying to make sure we appear, I do this all the time, rational, competent, mention key points, don't get too excited, and really wanting to shout at the television. And that's the balance we have to work in if we're going to be influential, because we need to be at the table, many tables in all parts of the system, and yet we can be dismissed so easily. I couldn't decide about whether the director was a patronising, I'm trying to edit my swear words, a patronising man saying, "I wanted Helen because she's bossy." Helen's a substantial actress. What do you mean she's bossy? So lots and lots of things in there that we would all face. I bet every one of us has an experience of something like that. And that's the world we live in.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And I wonder, with the director of the recent movie Twisters, what his attitude was to selecting, the women leads, and whether he or not he would have dared say the word bossy or not, but also what his selection criteria kind of was. And as you say, Margaret, a question for an entire seminar on its own. Mika, you're a scientist, and as we spoke about, you've advised at incident control centres and state control centres. How does gender play a role in your world?
In an interesting way. So a lot of the time when I work in state control centres, it's with the fire agencies and emergency management. And of course, it is very male dominated. there's a lot of men in there. But in some ways, it kind of plays to my favour in a way, because I've got scientific knowledge that they don't have. And it's taken a long time. It's not something you can just pick off the shelf. It's taken me 25 years to develop that scientific knowledge. But it's information that's really important to them. And I've got access through the Bureau's resources to a whole suite of information, which is really valuable. And the one thing I think that I have as a woman is that I'm very good at communicating it and contextualising it. So it kind of comes back to what Rosie was saying. She doesn't necessarily have the science, but she's obviously really good at pattern recognition. And women tend to be good at pattern recognition, and we also tend to be really good at networking and collaborating. So when you're in an emergency management situation and you've got not only the science to draw on, but also some of those skills like networking and communication, the ability to collaborate, it can end up being a really, really valuable set of skills that work in favour in terms of making the better decisions in the room. And ultimately, that's what everybody in there wants. They want to make the best decisions. So if you can contribute something in the value piece that really adds to that, then it makes a massive difference. And I think as well in emergency management, there tends to be less egos than in some other places, because it's not a good place for egos, because things go wrong. So a lot of the people who are there genuinely because they actually want to do the right thing and they want to help. And they know that we need to collaborate. So I think in some ways it's actually a space where women can contribute really effectively, but you've got to do a huge amount of groundwork in actually developing the knowledge and developing that experience that then gives you the ability to contribute effectively.
Wow, thank you so much. And I think, what I really heard there was, that knowledge and that experience and expertise that is developed over many years. You don't develop that just by walking in the room with a big ego. And I don't know about anybody else, but I'm kind of thinking of Donald Trump right now. A question for Tara. I might actually combine these two questions. Will the overall influence of disaster movies become more negative to women, given the rise of right-wing populism and Trumpism around the world? But also sort of attached to that, if you like, is, yes, of course, you've got Hollywood needs to meet box office requirements and recoup their costs and so forth, but film has the opportunity to change social norms. So how is Hollywood going to balance this thing between, populism and, the influence that can be made through film in social norms and with issues around gender equality?
They're good questions. And I'm glad they've been asked, because I saw them in the chat and I was like, I'll wait to have an opportunity to answer them. I'll start with the second one first, because I think the best way for this to be sort of tackled is not through disaster movies per se, but through other kinds of genres. Like, that's why I brought up something like Arrival, because it was scalable. It wasn't actually a blockbuster budget. It was made for less than $50 million, and then it recouped it, I think twice over. But also television series. And I think that point, Margaret, I think you started with that point about, we always see the disaster itself, but we don't see maybe the planning and the management that goes around it or after it. And I think about something like, for example, Chernobyl, the HBO series, obviously, again, a different kind of event, but that the television series offer an opportunity for this kind of more character depth and, communities and how communities deal with situations like this. So I would say that it has to come through different genres, but I will say that there is a shift in how blockbusters are dealing with like audience, because I said that 4-quadrant model isn't actually as strong as it used to be, because there is now being seen to be more value in catering to niche markets. The idea of the mass audience is eroding, so there's opportunity for that. So I wouldn't say that the big budget equals this kind of approach. Simply, but we can see that with something like Twisters, as we've heard, the conventions of that, aren't as problematic. There are still a lot of problematic things about both, but Twister probably has a lot more. But the point about Trump is a difficult one. It's very difficult to predict what position Hollywood will be put in. America doesn't have yet government control in the same way that national cinemas have. So how Hollywood deals with this will depend on government interference, because, you know, there is a lot of narrative around how, you know, progressive Hollywood is in comparison to what's happening politically for America. But as I said too, these tropes don't just happen in America. So it's hard to, there's a chicken and the egg about this, right? A lot of the things we're talking about, I mean, I've also experienced them in my sector. These aren't things that I think we're learning from movies. That approach to psychology and social norms has been kind of disproven. We're not a product just of movies. Movies also reflect how we behave. So I wouldn't blame it all on the movies. And so I don't necessarily think that Hollywood will just succumb, but at the same time, there is an opportunity, as I mentioned before, that we can see more stories that reflect the issues with climate change. And I think that is what we're going to see. And it might be done in much more subtle ways. Long answer to that, I'm sorry, but yeah, there's a subtlety needed, I think, in this current time.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much, Tara. And a couple of questions for Rosie. We are fast coming to the end of our discussion today, and I'm personally really disappointed because I feel like we could easily spend another hour digging into this. And I think perhaps next time, and we do hope to repeat this with some different disaster movies, we might give ourselves a bit more time so that we can really get into the nitty-gritty of it. But Rosie, what's it like as a woman navigating the physical realities of storm chasing, that, you know, the risk taking, the being out in remote areas alone, chasing at night, or balancing responsibilities like motherhood or other caring responsibilities?
Yeah, it's quite tricky. You know, I've chased for the last 10 years. My children are now grown, but they were teenagers when almost teenagers when I separated from their father, and so often had time where I needed to be present for them, but also wanting to balance the need for my own time. In the end, they would actually come with me, and actually fostered quite a lifelong interest in weather for them as well as I've had some reasonable influence around health-based things. They're both in health-based professions now, but I think there's a definite tension there around the roles that you play and how your hobby impacts upon those, and then what people think about that. And I know in America, a lot of male chasers that I follow on social media, they're like, oh, I'm just going to go off and chase now. And you're like, well, what about your family? You know, like, what about your kids? You know, you just up and go. You know, is your wife, partner, or home person happy for you to be doing that? And do you allow them the same kind of freedoms back the other way to let them go pursue their interests? And I kind of raised this, you know, a bit of a conversation about those gender roles of, you know, what if I was just to leave my husband, which I do, and just go chasing. I do actually say to him, see you later. I'm not going to see you for, you know, quite a few hours or pretty much the whole day. I'm just going to go chasing. You know, and people are a little bit more taken aback when a woman wants to do those things versus a man just choosing to go and do that. It's like go playing golf on a Saturday, you know, see you later. I'm going to go play golf, and everybody's, oh yeah, that's okay. That's his time. If I want to just go and chase a storm, people are like, why would you do that? You're a woman, you know. You know, there's security to answer a bit more of those questions, and mindful of the time. I'd love to talk further about this, but you know, the chasing on your own. I've chased out the back of out to St. George and Surat and those kind of areas, and they're really quite remote and on their own. I actually hit a kangaroo once, and I was on my own. It was terrible. You know, but there's a lot of that sense of I'm here on my own. I am quite vulnerable. You know, in today's society, if you're pulling up out in the front of somebody's property, they tend to get a little bit antsy about who are you and why you're here. If you pull out a tripod and a camera, they wake up pretty quickly why you're there. But there's a lot of risks around that, and I think that's something worth being mindful of as a woman in this role. But my male chasing friends actually point out that they feel equally as vulnerable nowadays, particularly in the more rural and remote kind of areas. I think there was a terrible incident where the police were shot in Tara, and we actually chase out in that area. And so I'm really mindful that it's not a safe hobby in that regard from a personal safety point of view. But then there's also the risks of what I'm actually chasing. So there's the risk of giant hail, lightning, flash flooding, the wild winds, all of that. And so really weighing that up. And I'm finding that in discussing with a lot of my female counterparts in America, plus my female counterparts here in Australia, we tend to take less risks overall. We tend to be more risk averse. We tend to get in the car earlier when there's lightning dropping around us everywhere. We don't want to drive in and experience the hail, although it is fun. I don't like to smash up my car. I need my car. I have responsibilities. I don't want to waste money on getting my car repaired because it's been smashed to pieces or I lose a windscreen. That's actually a reflection of the movies that isn't real. If you drive in a tornado, you're going to lose your windscreen, you're going to lose your windows, you're going to roll your car, like that aspect of the movies, which I didn't quite get to, isn't accurate. It's very dangerous to do that stuff. People have died, being caught up in tornadoes. They flip cars. They're very, very dangerous. It's a very dangerous, and you really need to know what you're doing. So education is really key to know how to do it, what the risks are, how to escape. Always got to have an escape plan. You've got to be aware. Your situational awareness is really important. Plus just understanding what is going on, looking at the sky and reading that really well is super, super important. There's aspects, for women like, managing periods, needing toilets. If you're chasing with other males, what do? Do you pull over and just say, everybody turn the other way while I cop a squat on the side of the road? Remembering where the last toilet was that you saw so that you can go back if you have to. I've encountered all of those things, and certainly I know that, for fire, people that work in CFA and things like that, that must be equally as difficult to manage some of those things when you're with a bunch of blokes in a truck and suddenly you get your period, and what do you do then? So managing all those more female aspects of our lives, which we all just get on and do. There's so many more things that we have to kind of manage than generally men do. That makes things a little bit more complex, and you just kind of have to fit that in to the whole thing. I'd love to talk about this forever.
I can absolutely tell. We are over time, and I would like to absolutely thank, from the bottom of my heart, all of our panellists for coming along today and presenting the really fascinating perspectives on two disaster films. Please complete our webinar poll. It does help us to design and organise events that are of interest to our members. Rosie, in particular, lives in Brisbane, so is preparing both from a personal perspective for the cyclone as well as from a hobby perspective. Rosie, please do share some of the photographs that you may manage to capture, and we certainly wish you, your family and loved ones and the entire community every safety and good luck over the next few days.
No.
Thank you to all our members who've come along. Thank you to our panellists, Gender and Disaster Australia. Thank you for partnering with us on this. Let's do another one really soon. This has been so much fun, and I think we can all agree we've all learnt an awful lot in just an hour. So thank you so much, and good afternoon.